we republished one of your pieces from the Dispatch that you wrote about the Washington Post, and they won the Pulitzer for this piece that they did, where they essentially published graphic photos from mass shootings at schools that involved AR-15s. And I just wanted to get into that a little bit with you before we end the show here. And, because we talked about this a lot on the Dispatch Live, so we won't go as deeply into it here, but I think there's still a couple things that we could hit. For instance, like you just set up, but I think that one of the problems that I had with this piece, what the Post did, is that it relies on this concept that you see a lot in major media, which is that if people just that opposition to restrictive gun policies that a lot of editors or broadcasters would like to see implemented is mostly based off of ignorance or perhaps callousness, that people just don't know how bad it is when somebody murders a bunch of children. And if we just showed them pictures, graphic photos of this, then they would understand and agree with us, or either that, or they're just kind of monsters. So let's be, I mean, that's the implication I get from this. They don't say that directly.
It's shock as a substitute for argument.
Yeah. And so, I don't know, where does the Washington Post piece come down on that spectrum for you?
Well, so something you and I think maybe have a slight disagreement about is that I'm not really particularly against the use of graphic imagery in journalism. I think it's often very useful. I think that in general, American newspapers and news outlets are too squeamish about things rather than not squeamish enough. I've been reporting for a long time and seen some genuinely awful things, some of which I think probably should have been photographed and put in more newspapers than they were. Now, of course, the idea that people killed with bullets fired from AR-15s are a special set of people, and that people who are gunned down with 9mm handguns or 12-gauge shotguns or anything else are not in that special category of people is something that people like the Post report or pieces like the Post report are trying to create these artificial fake categories of things. And, the Post series was, I think, highly, highly propagandistic in that way. It's propagandistic because it is made to carry out a political strategy rather than to be an act of journalism. And the political strategy is this. People who are in favor of gun control cannot, for political reasons, be very direct about what it is they want, which is essentially the prohibition of most or all firearms in the United States in private hands. So the thing that makes the AR-15 and rifles like that useful for lots of things, including doing horrible things, is the fact that it's semi-automatic and that it has a detachable box magazine, which makes it quick to reload. That also describes almost every handgun currently sold in the United States. And there's still a few revolver fans out there like me, but not very many of us. But it also describes the great majority of rifles sold in the United States now. There are a few people who shoot bolt action rifles and lever action rifles and things like that. But well more than half of the rifles sold in the United States in a year are AR pattern rifles. And if you take all semi-automatic rifles with detachable magazines, you get different numbers if you ask different people, but it's probably something north of 80% of the rifles sold every year. A great number of the shotguns sold now are semi-automatic as well, although not as many with detachable magazines. So if what you want to do is target the qualities of the AR-15 and similar rifles that make them distinctive in that way, you're basically talking about a blanket ban on firearms, at least on firearms designs that are more recent in the 19th century. Although it's probably worth pointing out that Americans have been buying semi-automatic rifles since 1903, when I guess it was it Winchester that introduced the first semi-automatic? It was a .22 hunting rifle. It was 1903. It's either Winchester or Remington.
That's a good question. I mean, definitely turn of the 19th century is when semi-automatics became a reliable, common.
Yeah. They've been around for a long time. Of course, I mean, this audience doesn't need to be told this, but AR-15 type rifles have been sold to American civilians since the early 1960s. and without too much trouble for many of those years. So what they're doing, instead of presenting a case that's based on something that's very difficult to defend politically, it's invent this iconic totemic thing about the AR-15, treated as some special, dangerous weapon of war item. And because it's easier to run a campaign against a tiny minority than it is to run a campaign against a majority. It's easier to identify and limit one small particular thing for invective than a whole class of things. This is, a very old-fashioned kind of political calculation. So we get these myths about the AR-15, and the Washington Post story was, of course, full of them. I won't go into the whole physics lecture here, but
people should read the full piece to get that.
Yeah, the idea that just velocity is something that makes something especially dangerous ignores the fact that there are a lot of bullets out there that move a lot faster than the 5.56.
Certainly.
There are a lot of AR-type rifles that are chambered for different rounds. And every day you get hit by things going 96% of the speed of light. You never notice it because they're very, very small. Mass matters too. Mm-hmm. As I always point out to people, people like Joe Biden always say, well, we don't want to take away your hunting rifles that you're going to use for legitimate purposes, which are multiple times more powerful than your typical 5.56 AR. Again, I don't want to be ghoulish about this, and it's easy to talk about this in a way that makes you sound like, I'm macho man and you're, posturing. But there are a lot of people who get shot with 5.56 rifles who survive. You're not going to survive getting shot with a big game rifle. You're just not. It's made to kill bull elk and Cape buffalo and things like that. You're not going to get through that.
Yeah.
So
certainly,
whatever our criterion is, it's impossible to draw up a criterion that really just covers scary looking black military derived rifles that does anything meaningful. So if you really want to, confiscate firearms in the United States, that's a conversation you can have. You can have the conversation about repealing the Second Amendment and all that stuff. But the people who are making these arguments don't really have the courage of their convictions. They refuse to be forthright about, what their actual agenda is. And so they end up engaged in this kind of weird culture war, symbolic politics around this very small subset of firearms that aren't really particularly special.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I want to get at too, is like, one, obviously you're not saying that the AR-15 is not perfectly capable of killing people. It clearly is. Yeah. And frankly, in my view, we're talking about weapons here, that there's a lot of focus on the AR-15 and these sorts of mass shootings, and you can understand that they have been involved in a lot of the most sensational ones, the worst mass shootings that have happened. So there's some. It also happens to be the most popular rifle in the country. Yeah. I think there's some level of social proofing among these kind of shooters.
Yes,
where there's a bit of copycatting going on, where they Sandy Hook shooter used the AR-15, so I'm going to use it.
Yeah, it's psychologically powerful on both sides, right? So there are people on the gun control side who see it as a special, evil, villainous thing, and there's a sort of kind of rightist, violent ideology that takes the AR-15 as a symbol of freedom or nationalism or whatever their nihilistic particular agenda is, and so it's a culture war symbol on both sides, definitely.
And to me, I don't think that the weapon, mass murder has been carried out by all sorts of different weapons over the years, including lots of different kinds of firearms, from bolt action rifles in the University of Texas shooting, the pump action shotgun in there's Texas high school shooting where
dynamite in the worst school massacre in American history.
Yeah, and I don't think that these kinds of events that they're documenting with these pictures are ones where you need any sort of specialized weaponry you're talking about killing innocent people at short ranges. It's not something that requires any sort of special super weapon to do, unfortunately. And that's the other half of it, is that the pictures from these other events are also going to be equally as horrific, I can guarantee you, as the ones that the Washington Post published. And, it's not to me the publishing of graphic images that I object to. It's the logic that they're using. Because you can look at a similar time frame, other, I believe Pulitzer winning stories that use graphic photos, including the massacre of Ukrainians in Bucha by the Russian forces, which absolutely produced shocking graphic images, or even obviously all the coverage of the October 7th massacre of Israelis by Hamas. But generally, my understanding of it in our industry has been that you publish these sorts of images as evidence for the lengths that this organized group is willing to go to carry out their goals, because you're trying to learn something about the psychology of the Russian military or leadership, or Hamas and the terrorist organizations, and how they think and how they operate and what they're willing to do. Whereas, I don't know what we're learning from seeing these images of individual killers who don't have any sort of ideological backing to what they're trying to, it just doesn't, I don't think it actually informs anybody of anything. And instead, it's more of, honestly, it's more to make their audience feel morally superior for agreeing that these guns should be banned because they can produce horrible images like this.
It's emotional manipulation.
Yeah.
And again, there's a time for graphic images. I mean, one of my colleagues, Jean-Marc Bugeaud, was an AP photographer who won the Pulitzer Prize for his photographs of the genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah,
and
I totally
these are
agree.
Nightmare-inducing pictures, and it's important that they got out there.
Yes.
I also think there's a case for running graphic images from people who've been killed by drunk drivers and other sorts of social issues that are important.
Sure.
Again, as an editor, I was a little more promiscuous with these kinds of images than maybe.
I just think that the Post's justification was literally just that they're shocking images.
Right.
I didn't see anything beyond that.
And they certainly do not, have a similar standard when it comes to people who are victims of Islamic terrorism or people who are victims of ordinary crime in Washington. They're definitely making a propagandistic effort with this piece. And the Pulitzer Committee, of course, blessed it because that's what they do these days.